Face indeed, said Mitchell Arden, but I am sorry for the amiable sister of Apollo, a very pitted face. But the travelers, now so near the end, were incessantly observing this new world. They imagined themselves walking through its unknown countries, climbing its highest peaks, descending into its lowest depths. Here and there they fancied they saw vast seas, scarcely kept together under so rarefied an atmosphere, and watercourses emptying the mountain tributaries. Leaning over the abyss, they hoped to catch some sounds from that orb forever mute in the solitude of space. That last day left them. They took down the most trifling details. A vague uneasiness took possession of them as they neared the end. This uneasiness would have been doubled had they felt how their speed had decreased. It would have seemed to them quite insufficient to carry them to the end. It was because the projectile then weighed almost nothing. Its weight was ever decreasing and would be entirely annihilated on that line where the lunar and terrestrial attractions would neutralize each other. But in spite of his preoccupation, Mitchell Arden did not forget to prepare the morning repast with his accustomed punctuality. They ate with a good appetite. Nothing was so excellent as the soup liquefied by the heat of the gas, nothing better than the preserved meat. Some glasses of good French wine crowned the repast, causing Mitchell Arden to remark that the lunar vines, warmed by that ardent sun, ought to distill even more generous wines. That is, if they existed. In any case, the farseeing Frenchman had taken care not to forget in his collection some precious cuttings of the Medoc and Côte d'Or, upon which he founded his hopes. Risette and Rignot's apparatus worked with great regularity. Not an atom of carbonic acid resisted the potash, and as to the oxygen, Captain Nicholl said it was of the first quality. The little watery vapor enclosed in the projectile mixing with the air tempered the dryness, and many apartments in London, Paris, or New York, and many theaters were certainly not in such a healthy condition. But that it might act with regularity, the apparatus must be kept in perfect order. So each morning Mitchell visited the escape regulators, tried the taps, and regulated the heat of the gas by the pyrometer. Everything had gone well up to that time, and the travelers, imitating the worthy Joseph T. Maston, began to acquire a degree of embonpoint which would have rendered them unrecognizable if their imprisonment had been prolonged to some months. In a word, they behaved like chickens in a coop. They were getting fat. In looking through, the scuttle Barbicane saw the spectre of the dog and other divers objects which had been thrown from the projectile, obstinately following them. Diana howled lugubriously on seeing the remains of satellite, which seemed as motionless as if they reposed on solid earth. "Do you know, my friends," said Mitchell Arden, "that if one of us had succumbed to the shock consequent on departure, we should have had a great deal of trouble to bury him. What am I saying? To etherize him, as here ether takes the place of earth. You see, the accusing body would have followed us into space like a remorse." "That would have been sad," said Nicholl. "Ah," continued Mitchell, "what I regret is not being able to take a walk outside. What voluptuousness to float amid this radiant ether, to bathe oneself in it, to wrap oneself in the sun's pure rays. If Barbicane had only thought of furnishing us with a diving apparatus and an air pump, I could have ventured out and assumed fanciful attitudes of feigned monsters on the top of the projectile." "Well, old Mitchell," replied Barbicane, "you would not have made a feigned monster long, for in spite of your diver's dress, swollen by the expansion of air within you, you would have burst like a shell, or rather like a balloon which has risen too high. So do not regret it, and do not forget this. As long as we float in space, all sentimental walks beyond the projectile are forbidden." Mitchell Arden allowed himself to be convinced to a certain extent. He admitted that the thing was difficult but not impossible, a word which he never uttered. The conversation passed from this subject to another, not failing him for an instant. It seemed to the three friends as though, under present conditions, ideas shot up in their brains as leaves shoot at the first warmth of spring. They felt bewildered. In the middle of the questions and answers which crossed each other, Nicholl put one question which did not find an immediate solution. "Ah, indeed," said he, "it is all very well to go to the moon, but how to get back again?" His two interlocutors looked surprised. One would have thought that this possibility now occurred to them for the first time. "What do you mean by that, Nicholl?" asked Barbicane gravely. To ask for means to leave a country, added Mitchell, when we have not yet arrived there, seems to me rather inopportune. I do not say that, wishing to draw back, replied Nishal, but I repeat my question and I ask, how shall we return? I know nothing about it, answered Barbicane. And I, said Mitchell, if I had known how to return, I would never have started. There's an answer, cried Nishal. I quite approve of Mitchell's words, said Barbicane, and add that the question has no real interest. Later, when we think it is advisable to return, we will take counsel together. If the Columbiad is not there, the projectile will be. That is a step certainly, a ball without a gun. The gun, replied Barbicane, can be manufactured. The powder can be made. Neither metals, saltpeter, nor coal can fail in the depths of the moon, and we need only go 8,000 leagues in order to fall upon the terrestrial globe by virtue of the mere laws of weight. Enough, said Mitchell with animation. Let it be no longer a question of returning. We have already entertained it too long. As to communicating with our former earthly colleagues, that will not be difficult. And how? By means of meteors launched by lunar volcanoes. Well thought of, Mitchell, said Barbicane in a convinced tone of voice. Laplace has calculated that a force 5 times greater than that of our gun would suffice to send a meteor from the moon to the earth, and there is not one volcano which has not a greater power of propulsion than that. Hurrah, exclaimed Mitchell, these meteors are handy postmen and cost nothing, and how we shall be able to laugh at the post office administration, but now I think of it. What do you think of? A capital idea. Why did we not fasten a thread to our projectile, and we could have exchanged telegrams with the earth? The deuce, answered Nishal. Do you consider the weight of a 0 miles long nothing? As nothing, they could have trebled the Columbiad's charge, they could have quadrupled or quintupled it, exclaimed Mitchell, with whom the verb took a higher intonation each time. There is but one little objection to make to your proposition, replied Barbicane, which is that, during the rotary motion of the globe, our thread would have wound itself round it like a chain on a capstan, and that it would inevitably have brought us to the ground. By the 39 stars of the Union, said Mitchell, I have nothing but impracticable ideas today, ideas worthy of J.T. Maston. But I have a notion that, if we do not return to Earth, J.T. Maston will be able to come to us. Yes, he'll come, replied Barbicane. He is a worthy and a courageous comrade. Besides, what is easier? Is not the Columbiad still buried in the soil of Florida? Is cotton and nitric acid wanted wherewith to manufacture the pyroxyle? Will not the moon pass the zenith of Florida? In 18 years' time will she not occupy exactly the same place as today? Yes, continued Mitchell, yes, Maston will come, and with him our friends Elphinstone, Blomsbury, all the members of the Gun Club, and they will be well received. And by they will run trains of projectiles between the earth and the moon. Hurrah for J.T. Maston. It is probable that if the Hun, J.T. Maston, did not hear the hurrahs uttered in his honor, his ears at least tingled. What was he doing then? Doubtless, posted in the Rocky Mountains at the station of Long's Peak, he was trying to find the invisible projectile gravitating in space. If he was thinking of his dear companions, we must allow that they were not far behind him, and that, under the influence of a strange excitement, they were devoting to him their best thoughts. But whence this excitement, which was evidently growing upon the tenants of the projectile? Their sobriety could not be doubted. This strange irritation of the brain, must it be attributed to the peculiar circumstances under which they found themselves, to their proximity to the orb of night, from which only a few hours separated them, to some secret influence of the moon acting upon their nervous system? Their faces were as rosy as if they had been exposed to the roaring flames of an oven. Their voices resounded in loud accents. Their words escaped like a champagne cork driven out by carbonic acid. Their gestures became annoying. They wanted so much room to perform them, and strange to say, they none of them noticed this great tension of the mind. Now, said Nishal, in a short tone, now that I do not know whether we shall ever return from the moon, I want to know what we are going to do there." "What we are going to do there," replied Barbicane, stamping with his foot as if he was in a fencing saloon, "I do not know." "You do not know," exclaimed Mitchell, with a bellow which provoked a sonorous echo in the projectile. "No, I have not even thought about it," retorted Barbicane in the same loud tone. "Well, I know," replied Mitchell. "Speak, then," cried Nicholl, who could no longer contain the growling of his voice. "I shall speak if it suits me," exclaimed Mitchell, seizing his companion's arms with violence. "It must suit you," said Barbicane, with an eye on fire and a threatening hand. "It was you who drew us into this frightful journey, and we want to know what for." "Yes," said the captain, "now that I do not know where I am going, I want to know why I am going." "Why," exclaimed Mitchell, jumping a yard high, "why, to take possession of the moon in the name of the United States, to add a 40th state to the Union, to colonize the lunar regions, to cultivate them, to people them, to transport thither all the prodigies of art, of science, and industry, to civilize the Selenites, unless they are more civilized than we are, and to constitute them a republic if they are not already one." "And if there are no Selenites," retorted Nicholl, who, under the influence of this unaccountable intoxication, was very contradictory. "Who said that there were no Selenites?" exclaimed Mitchell in a threatening tone. "I do," howled Nicholl. "Captain," said Mitchell, "do not repeat that insolence, or I will knock your teeth down your throat." The two adversaries were going to fall upon each other, and the incoherent discussion threatened to merge into a fight, when Barbicane intervened with one bound. "Stop, miserable men," said he, separating his two companions. "If there are no Selenites, we will do without them." "Yes," exclaimed Mitchell, who was not particular, "yes, we will do without them. We have only to make Selenites. Down with the Selenites." "The empire of the moon belongs to us," said Nicholl. "Let us three constitute the republic." "I will be the Congress," cried Mitchell. "And I the Senate," retorted Nicholl. "And Barbicane the president," howled Mitchell. "Not a president elected by the nation," replied Barbicane. "Very well, a president elected by the Congress," cried Mitchell, "and as I am the Congress, you are unanimously elected." "Hurrah, hurrah, hurrah, for President Barbicane," exclaimed Nicholl. "Hip, hip, hip," vociferated Mitchell Arden. Then the President and the Senate struck up, in a tremendous voice, the popular song Yankee Doodle, while from the Congress resounded the masculine tones of the Marseillaise. Then they struck up a frantic dance, with maniacal gestures, idiotic stampings, and somersaults like those of the boneless clowns in the circus. Diana, joining in the dance, and howling in her turn, jumped to the top of the projectile. An unaccountable flapping of wings was then heard amid most fantastic cock crows, while 5 or 6 hens fluttered like bats against the walls. Then the three traveling companions, acted upon by some unaccountable influence above that of intoxication, inflamed by the air which had set their respiratory apparatus on fire, fell motionless to the bottom of the projectile. Chapter 8. At 78,514 leagues. What had happened, whence the cause of this singular intoxication, the consequences of which might have been very disastrous. A simple blunder of Mitchell's, which, fortunately, Nicholl was able to correct in time. After a perfect swoon, which lasted some minutes, the captain, recovering first, soon collected his scattered senses. Although he had breakfasted only 2 hours before, he felt annoying hunger, as if he had not eaten anything for several days. Everything about him, stomach and brain, were overexcited to the highest degree. He got up and demanded from Mitchell a supplementary repast. Mitchell, utterly done up, did not answer. Nicholl then tried to prepare some tea destined to help the absorption of a dozen sandwiches. He first tried to get some fire and struck a match sharply. What was his surprise to see the sulfur shine with so extraordinary a brilliancy as to be almost unbearable to the eye. From the gas burner which he lit rose a flame equal to a jet of electric light. A revelation dawned on Nishal's mind. That intensity of light, the physiological troubles which had arisen in him, the overexcitement of all his moral and quarrelsome faculties, he understood all. "The oxygen," he exclaimed. And leaning over the air apparatus, he saw that the tap was allowing the colorless gas to escape freely, life-giving, but in its pure state producing the gravest disorders in the system. Mitchell had blunderingly opened the tap of the apparatus to the full. Nishal hastened to stop the escape of oxygen with which the atmosphere was saturated, which would have been the death of the travelers, not by suffocation, but by combustion. An hour later, the air less charged with it restored the lungs to their normal condition. By degrees, the three friends recovered from their intoxication, but they were obliged to sleep themselves sober over their oxygen as a drunkard does over his wine. When Mitchell learned his share of the responsibility of this incident, he was not much disconcerted. This unexpected drunkenness broke the monotony of the journey. Many foolish things had been said while under its influence, but also quickly forgotten. "And then," added the merry Frenchman, "I am not sorry to have tasted a little of this heady gas. Do you know, my friends, that a curious establishment might be founded with rooms of oxygen, where people whose system is weakened could, for a few hours, live a more active life. Fancy parties where the room was saturated with this heroic fluid, theaters where it should be kept at high pressure. What passion in the souls of the actors and spectators! What fire, what enthusiasm! And if instead of an assembly only a whole people could be saturated, what activity in its functions, what a supplement to life it would derive! From an exhausted nation they might make a great and strong one, and I know more than one state in old Europe which ought to put itself under the regime of oxygen for the sake of its health." Mitchell spoke with so much animation that one might have fancied that the tap was still too open, but a few words from Barbicane soon shattered his enthusiasm. "That is all very well, friend Mitchell," said he, "but will you inform us where these chickens came from which have mixed themselves up in our concert?" "Those chickens?" "Yes." Indeed, half a dozen chickens and a fine cock were walking about, flapping their wings and chattering. "Ah, the awkward things!" exclaimed Mitchell. "The oxygen has made them revolt." "But what do you want to do with these chickens?" asked Barbicane. "To acclimatize them in the moon, by Jove." "Then why did you hide them?" "A joke, my worthy president, a simple joke, which has proved a miserable failure. I wanted to set them free on the lunar continent without saying anything. Oh, what would have been your amazement on seeing these earthly-winged animals pecking in your lunar fields." "You rascal, you unmitigated rascal," replied Barbicane, "you do not want oxygen to mount to the head. You are always what we were under the influence of the gas. You are always foolish." "Ah, who says that we were not wise then?" replied Mitchell Arden. After this philosophical reflection, the three friends set about restoring the order of the projectile. Chickens and cock were reinstated in their coop, but while proceeding with this operation, Barbicane and his two companions had a most desired perception of a new phenomenon. From the moment of leaving the earth, their own weight, that of the projectile, and the objects it enclosed, had been subject to an increasing diminution. If they could not prove this loss of the projectile, a moment would arrive when it would be sensibly felt upon themselves and the utensils and instruments they used. It is needless to say that a scale would not show this loss, for the weight destined to weight the object would have lost exactly as much as the object itself. But a spring steelyard, for example, the tension of which was independent of the attraction, would have given a just estimate of this loss. We know that the attraction, otherwise called the weight, is in proportion to the densities of the bodies and inversely as the squares of the distances. Hence this effect. If the Earth had been alone in space, if the other celestial bodies had been suddenly annihilated, the projectile, according to Newton's laws, would weigh less as it got farther from the Earth, but without ever losing its weight entirely, for the terrestrial attraction would always have made itself felt, at whatever distance. But in reality, a time must come when the projectile would no longer be subject to the law of weight, after allowing for the other celestial bodies whose effect could not be set down as zero. Indeed, the projectile's course was being traced between the Earth and the Moon. As it distanced the Earth, the terrestrial attraction diminished, but the lunar attraction rose in proportion. There must come a point where these two attractions would neutralize each other. The projectile would possess weight no longer. If the Moon's and the Earth's densities had been equal, this point would have been at an equal distance between the two orbs. But taking the different densities into consideration, it was easy to reckon that this point would be situated at 47/60 ths of the whole journey, i.e., at 78,514 leagues from the Earth. At this point, a body having no principle of speed or displacement in itself would remain immovable forever, being attracted equally by both orbs, and not being drawn more toward one than toward the other. Now, if the projectile's impulsive force had been correctly calculated, it would attain this point without speed, having lost all trace of weight, as well as all the objects within it. What would happen then? Three hypotheses presented themselves. Such was their situation, and Barbicane clearly explained the consequences to his traveling companions, which greatly interested them. But how should they know when the projectile had reached this neutral point situated at that distance, especially when neither themselves nor the objects enclosed in the projectile would be any longer subject to the laws of weight? Up to this time, the travelers, while admitting that this action was constantly decreasing, had not yet become sensible to its total absence. But that day, about 11 o'clock in the morning, Nicholl having accidentally let a glass slip from his hand, the glass, instead of falling, remained suspended in the air. "Ah," exclaimed Michel Ardan, "that is rather an amusing piece of natural philosophy." And immediately divers other objects, firearms and bottles, abandoned to themselves, held themselves up as by enchantment. Diana, too, placed in space by Michel, reproduced, but without any trick, the wonderful suspension practiced by Caston and Robert Houdin. Indeed, the dog did not seem to know that she was floating in air. The three adventurous companions were surprised and stupefied despite their scientific reasonings. They felt themselves being carried into the domain of wonders. They felt that weight was really wanting to their bodies. If they stretched out their arms, they did not attempt to fall. Their heads shook on their shoulders. Their feet no longer clung to the floor of the projectile. They were like drunken men having no stability in themselves. Fancy has depicted men without reflection, others without shadow. But here reality, by the neutralizations of attractive forces, produced men in whom nothing had any weight and who weighed nothing themselves. Suddenly Michel, taking a spring, left the floor and remained suspended in the air, like Murillo's monk of the Cuisine des Anges. The two friends joined him instantly, and all three formed a miraculous ascension in the center of the projectile. "Is it to be believed? Is it probable? Is it possible?" exclaimed Michel. "And yet it is so. Ah, if Raphael had seen us thus, what an assumption he would have thrown upon canvas." "The assumption cannot last," replied Barbicane. "If the projectile passes the neutral point, the lunar attraction will draw us to the Moon." "Then our feet will be upon the roof," replied Michel. "No," said Barbicane, "because the projectile's center of gravity is very low. It will only turn by degrees." "Then all our portables will be upset from top to bottom. That is a fact." "Calm yourself, Michel," replied Nicholl. "No upset is to be feared. Not a thing will move, for the projectile's evolution will be imperceptible." "Just so," continued Barbicane, "and when it has passed the point of equal attraction, its base, being the heavier, will draw it perpendicularly to the Moon. But in order that this phenomenon should take place, we must have passed the neutral line." "Pass the neutral line," cried Michel. "Then let us do as the sailors do when they cross the equator." A slight side movement brought Michel back toward the padded side. Thence he took a bottle and glasses, placed them in space before his companions, and drinking merrily, they saluted the line with a triple hurrah. The influence of these attractions scarcely lasted an hour. The travelers felt themselves insensibly drawn toward the floor, and Barbicane fancied that the conical end of the projectile was varying a little from its normal direction toward the moon. By an inverse motion, the base was approaching first. The lunar attraction was prevailing over the terrestrial. The fall toward the moon was beginning, almost imperceptibly as yet, but by degrees the attractive force would become stronger, the fall would be more decided. The projectile, drawn by its base, would turn its cone to the Earth and fall with ever-increasing speed onto the surface of the Selenite continent. Their destination would then be attained. Now nothing could prevent the success of their enterprise, and Nicholl and Mitchell Arden shared Barbicane's joy. Then they chatted of all the phenomena which had astonished them one after the other, particularly the neutralization of the laws of weight. Mitchell Arden, always enthusiastic, drew conclusions which were purely fanciful. "Ah, my worthy friends," he exclaimed, "what progress we should make if on Earth we could throw off some of that weight, some of that chain which binds us to her. It would be the prisoner set at liberty, no more fatigue of either arms or legs. Or if it is true that in order to fly on the Earth's surface, to keep oneself suspended in the air merely by the play of the muscles, there requires a strength 150 times greater than that which we possess, a simple act of volition, a caprice, would bear us into space, if attraction did not exist." "Just so," said Nicholl, smiling. "If we could succeed in suppressing weight as they suppress pain by anesthesia, that would change the face of modern society." "Yes," cried Mitchell, full of his subject, "destroy weight and no more burdens." "Well said," replied Barbicane, "but if nothing had any weight, nothing would keep in its place, not even your hat on your head, worthy Mitchell, nor your house, whose stones only adhere by weight, nor a boat whose stability on the waves is only caused by weight, not even the ocean, whose waves would no longer be equalized by terrestrial attraction, and lastly, not even the atmosphere, whose atoms, being no longer held in their places, would disperse in space." "That is tiresome," retorted Mitchell. "Nothing like these matter-of-fact people for bringing one back to the bare reality." "But console yourself, Mitchell," continued Barbicane, "for if no orb exists from whence all laws of weight are banished, you are at least going to visit one where it is much less than on the Earth." "The moon." "Yes, the moon, on whose surface objects weigh 6 times less than on the Earth, a phenomenon easy to prove." "And we shall feel it?" asked Mitchell. "Evidently, as 200 pounds will only weigh 30 pounds on the surface of the moon. And our muscular strength will not diminish." "Not at all. Instead of jumping 1 yard high, you will rise 18 feet high." "But we shall be regular Herculeses in the moon," exclaimed Mitchell. "Yes," replied Nicholl, "for if the height of the Selenites is in proportion to the density of their globe, they will be scarcely a foot high." "Lilliputians," ejaculated Mitchell, "I shall play the part of Gulliver. We are going to realize the fable of the giants. This is the advantage of leaving one's own planet and overrunning the solar world." "One moment, Mitchell," answered Barbicane. "If you wish to play the part of Gulliver, only visit the inferior planets, such as Mercury, Venus, or Mars, whose density is a little less than that of the Earth. But do not venture into the great planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, for there the order will be changed, and you will become Lilliputian." "And in the sun?" "In the sun, if its density is 1,324,000 times greater, and the attraction is 27 times greater than on the surface of our globe, keeping everything in proportion, the inhabitants ought to be at least 200 feet high." "By Jove," exclaimed Mitchell, "I should be nothing more than a pygmy, a shrimp." "Gulliver with the giants," said Nicholl. "Just so," replied Barbicane. "And it would not be quite useless to carry some pieces of artillery to defend oneself." "Good," replied Nicholl. "Your projectiles would have no effect on the sun. They would fall back upon the Earth after some minutes." "That is a strong remark." "It is certain," replied Barbicane. "The attraction is so great on this enormous orb that an object weighing 70,000 pounds on the Earth would weigh but 19-20 pounds on the surface of the sun. If you were to fall upon it, you would weigh, let me see, about 5,000 pounds, a weight which you would never be able to raise again." "The devil," said Mitchell. "One would want a portable crane. However, we will be satisfied with the moon for the present. There at least we shall cut a great figure. We will see about the sun by and by." Chapter 9. The Consequences of a Deviation. Barbicane had now no fear of the issue of the journey, at least as far as the projectile's impulsive force was concerned. Its own speed would carry it beyond the neutral line. It would certainly not return to Earth. It would certainly not remain motionless on the line of attraction. One single hypothesis remained to be realized: the arrival of the projectile at its destination by the action of the lunar attraction. It was in reality a fall of 8296 legs on an orb. It is true, where weight could only be reckoned at 1/6 of terrestrial weight. A formidable fall, nevertheless, and one against which every precaution must be taken without delay. These precautions were of two sorts: some to deaden the shock when the projectile should touch the lunar soil, others to delay the fall and consequently make it less violent. To deaden the shock, it was a pity that Barbicane was no longer able to employ the means which had so ably weakened the shock at departure, that is to say, by water used as springs and the partition breaks. The partitions still existed, but water failed, for they could not use their reserve, which was precious, in case during the first days the liquid element should be found wanting on lunar soil. And indeed this reserve would have been quite insufficient for a spring. The layer of water stored in the projectile at the time of starting upon their journey occupied no less than 3 feet in depth, and spread over a surface of not less than 54 square feet. Besides, the cistern did not contain 1/5 part of it. They must therefore give up this efficient means of deadening the shock of arrival. Happily, Barbicane, not content with employing water, had furnished the movable disc with strong spring plugs, destined to lessen the shock against the base after the breaking of the horizontal partitions. These plugs still existed. They had only to readjust them and replace the movable disc. Every piece, easy to handle, as their weight was now scarcely felt, was quickly mounted. The different pieces were fitted without trouble, it being only a matter of bolts and screws. Tools were not wanting, and soon the reinstated disc lay on steel plugs, like a table on its legs. One inconvenience resulted from the replacing of the disc. The lower window was blocked up. Thus it was impossible for the travelers to observe the moon from that opening while they were being precipitated perpendicularly upon her. But they were obliged to give it up. Even by the side openings, they could still see vast lunar regions, as an aeronaut sees the Earth from his car. This replacing of the disc was at least an hour's work. It was past 12 when all preparations were finished. Barbicane took fresh observations on the inclination of the projectile, but to his annoyance, it had not turned over sufficiently for its fall. It seemed to take a curve parallel to the lunar disc. The orb of night shone splendidly into space, while opposite, the orb of day blazed with fire. Their situation began to make them uneasy. "Are we reaching our destination?" said Nicholl. "Let us act as if we were about reaching it," replied Barbicane. "You are skeptical," retorted Mitchell Arden. "We shall arrive, and that too quicker than we like." This answer brought Barbicane back to his preparations, and he occupied himself with placing the contrivances intended to break their descent. We may remember the scene of the meeting held at Tampa Town, in Florida, when Captain Nicholl came forward as Barbicane's enemy and Mitchell Arden's adversary. To Captain Nicholl's maintaining that the projectile would smash like glass, Mitchell replied that he would break their fall by means of rockets properly placed. Thus, powerful fireworks, taking their starting point from the base and bursting outside, could, by producing a recoil, check to a certain degree the projectile's speed. These rockets were to burn in space, it is true, but oxygen would not fail them, for they could supply themselves with it, like the lunar volcanoes, the burning of which has never yet been stopped by the want of atmosphere round the moon. Barbicane had accordingly supplied himself with these fireworks, enclosed in little steel guns, which could be screwed on to the base of the projectile. Inside, these guns were flush with the bottom. Outside, they protruded about 18 inches. There were 20 of them. An opening left in the disc, allowed them to light the match with which each was provided. All the effect was felt outside. The burning mixture had already been rammed into each gun. They had then nothing to do but raise the metallic buffers fixed in the base and replace them by the guns, which fitted closely in their places. This new work was finished about 3 o'clock, and after taking all these precautions, there remained but to wait. But the projectile was perceptibly nearing the moon, and evidently succumbed to her influence to a certain degree, though its own velocity also drew it in an oblique direction. From these conflicting influences resulted a line which might become a tangent. But it was certain that the projectile would not fall directly on the moon, for its lower part, by reason of its weight, ought to be turned toward her. Barbicane's uneasiness increased as he saw his projectile resist the influence of gravitation. The unknown was opening before him, the unknown in interplanetary space. The man of science thought he had foreseen the only 3 hypotheses possible: the return to the Earth, the return to the moon, or stagnation on the neutral line. And here a 4th hypothesis, big with all the terrors of the infinite, surged up inopportunely. To face it without flinching, one must be a resolute savant like Barbicane, a phlegmatic being like Nicholl, or an audacious adventurer like Mitchell Arden. Conversation was started upon this subject. Other men would have considered the question from a practical point of view. They would have asked themselves whither their projectile carriage was carrying them. Not so with these. They sought for the cause which produced this effect. "So we have become diverted from our route," said Mitchell. "But why?" "I very much fear," answered Nicholl, "that, in spite of all precautions taken, the Columbiad was not fairly pointed. An error, however small, would be enough to throw us out of the moon's attraction." "Then they must have aimed badly?" asked Mitchell. "I do not think so," replied Barbicane. "The perpendicularity of the gun was exact, its direction to the zenith of the spot incontestable, and the moon passing to the zenith of the spot, we ought to reach it at the full. There is another reason, but it escapes me." "Are we not arriving too late?" asked Nicholl. "Too late," said Barbicane. "Yes," continued Nicholl. "The Cambridge Observatory's note says that the transit ought to be accomplished in 97 hours, 13 minutes, and 20 seconds, which means to say that sooner the moon will not be at the point indicated, and later it will have passed it." "True," replied Barbicane, "but we started the 1st of December at 13 minutes and 25 seconds to 11 at night, and we ought to arrive on the 5th at midnight, at the exact moment when the moon would be full, and we are now at the 5th of December. It is now 3:30 in the evening. 8:30 ought to see us at the end of our journey. Why do we not arrive?" "Might it not be an excess of speed?" answered Nicholl, "for we know now that its initial velocity was greater than they supposed." "No, 100 times no," replied Barbicane. "An excess of speed, if the direction of the projectile had been right, would not have prevented us reaching the moon. No, there has been a deviation. We have been turned out of our course." "By whom, by what?" asked Nicholl. "I cannot say," replied Barbicane. "Very well then, Barbicane," said Mitchell. "Do you wish to know my opinion on the subject of finding out this deviation?" "Speak." "I would not give $50 to know it. That we have deviated is a fact. Where we are going matters little. We shall soon see. Since we are being borne along in space, we shall end by falling into some center of attraction or other." Mitchell Arden's indifference did not content Barbicane. Not that he was uneasy about the future, but he wanted to know at any cost why his projectile had deviated. But the projectile continued its course sideways to the moon, and with it, the mass of things thrown out. Barbicane could even prove, by the elevations which served as landmarks upon the moon, which was only 2,000 leagues distant, that its speed was becoming uniform, fresh proof that there was no fall. Its impulsive force still prevailed over the lunar attraction, but the projectile's course was certainly bringing it nearer to the moon, and they might hope that at a nearer point the weight, predominating, would cause a decided fall. The 3 friends, having nothing better to do, continued their observations, but they could not yet determine the topographical position of the satellite. Every relief was leveled under the reflection of the solar rays. They watched thus through the side windows until 8 o'clock at night. The moon had grown so large in their eyes that it filled half of the firmament. The sun on one side and the orb of night on the other flooded the projectile with light. At that moment, Barbicane thought he could estimate the distance which separated them from their aim at no more than 700 leagues. The speed of the projectile seemed to him to be more than 200 yards, or about 170 leagues a second. Under the centripetal force, the base of the projectile tended toward the moon, but the centrifugals still prevailed, and it was probable that its rectilineal course would be changed to a curve of some sort, the nature of which they could not at present determine. Barbicane was still seeking the solution of his insoluble problem. Hours passed without any result. The projectile was evidently nearing the moon, but it was also evident that it would never reach her. As to the nearest distance at which it would pass her, that must be the result of two forces, attraction and repulsion, affecting its motion. "I ask but one thing," said Mitchell, "that we may pass near enough to penetrate her secrets." "Cursed be the thing that has caused our projectile to deviate from its course," cried Nicholl. And as if a light had suddenly broken in upon his mind, Barbicane answered, "Then cursed be the meteor which crossed our path." "What?" said Mitchell Arden. "What do you mean?" exclaimed Nicholl. "I mean," said Barbicane in a decided tone, "I mean that our deviation is owing solely to our meeting with this erring body." "But it did not even brush us as it passed," said Mitchell. "What does that matter? Its mass, compared to that of our projectile, was enormous, and its attraction was enough to influence our course." "So little," cried Nicholl. "Yes, Nicholl, but however little it might be," replied Barbicane, "in a distance of 84,000 leagues, it wanted no more to make us miss the moon." Chapter 10. The Observers of the Moon. Barbicane had evidently hit upon the only plausible reason of this deviation. However slight it might have been, it had sufficed to modify the course of the projectile. It was a fatality. The bold attempt had miscarried by a fortuitous circumstance, and unless by some exceptional event, they could now never reach the moon's disk. Would they pass near enough to be able to solve certain physical and geological questions, until then insoluble? This was the question, and the only one, which occupied the minds of these bold travelers. As to the fate in store for themselves, they did not even dream of it. But what would become of them amid these infinite solitudes, these who would soon want air? A few more days, and they would fall stifled in this wandering projectile. But some days to these intrepid fellows was a century, and they devoted all their time to observe that moon which they no longer hoped to reach. The distance which had then separated the projectile from the satellite was estimated at about 200 leagues. Under these conditions, as regards the visibility of the details of the disk, the travelers were farther from the moon than are the inhabitants of Earth with their powerful telescopes. Indeed, we know that the instrument mounted by Lord Rosse at Parsonstown, which magnifies 6,500 times, brings the moon to within an apparent distance of 16 leagues. And more than that, with the powerful one set up at Long's Peak, the orb of night, magnify 0 times, is brought to within less than 2 leagues, and objects having a diameter of 30 feet are seen very distinctly. So that, at this distance, the topographical details of the moon, observed without glasses, could not be determined with precision. The eye caught the vast outline of those immense depressions inappropriately called seas, but they could not recognize their nature. The prominence of the mountains disappeared under the splendid irradiation produced by the reflection of the solar rays. The eye, dazzled as if it was leaning over a bath of molten silver, turned from it involuntarily, but the oblong form of the orb was quite clear. It appeared like a gigantic egg, with the small end turned toward the earth. Indeed, the moon, liquid and pliable in the first days of its formation, was originally a perfect sphere, but being soon drawn within the attraction of the earth, it became elongated under the influence of gravitation. In becoming a satellite, she lost her native purity of form. Her center of gravity was in advance of the center of her figure, and from this fact, some savants draw the conclusion that the air and water had taken refuge on the opposite surface of the moon, which is never seen from the Earth. This alteration in the primitive form of the satellite was only perceptible for a few moments. The distance of the projectile from the moon diminished very rapidly under its speed, though that was much less than its initial velocity, but 8 or 9 times greater than that which propels our express trains. The oblique course of the projectile, from its very obliquity, gave Mitchell Arden some hopes of striking the lunar disk at some point or other. He could not think that they would never reach it. No, he could not believe it, and this opinion he often repeated. But Barbicane, who was a better judge, always answered him with merciless logic. No, Mitchell, no. We can only reach the moon by a fall, and we are not falling. The centripetal force keeps us under the moon's influence, but the centrifugal force draws us irresistibly away from it.